Imagine a mother's worst nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Her 2-year-old son, gone from the backyard in mere seconds, vanished into the dense forest that borders their rural home. As panic gripped the family and neighbors gathered to search, no one realized that little Ethan wasn't alone in those woods. The family's 3-month-old puppy Max had followed silently behind him, a tiny guardian with no training, but an instinct that would prove more powerful than anyone could have imagined. What happened over the next 17 hours would test the limits of hope as temperatures dropped dangerously low and wild animals prowled through the darkness. But in this terrifying ordeal, the bond between a small child and an even smaller puppy would reveal something extraordinary about loyalty that transcends species and defies explanation. Before we continue this incredible true story that will touch your heart, please subscribe to our channel right now so you never miss another tale of courage and connection that reminds us of the miraculous bonds between humans and animals. The Carter family had moved to the edge of Pinewood Forest just 8 months ago, drawn by the charm of rural living and the promise of raising their son Ethan closer to nature. Sarah, a nurse at the local hospital, and Michael, who worked remotely as a software engineer, had fallen in love with the sprawling property bordered by ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets with every breeze. Their 2-year-old son Ethan had thrived in the spacious backyard, his curious blue eyes always wide with wonder at butterflies, squirrels, and the endless fascination of dirt between his tiny fingers. "He's an explorer," Michael would proudly tell visitors as Ethan toddled across the lawn, investigating everything with intense concentration. Max had joined their family just 6 weeks ago, a small bundle of golden fur from the county animal shelter where Sarah volunteered on weekends. The puppy had been the sole survivor of an abandoned litter, his siblings too weak to make it. But Max had fought with a spirit that impressed the shelter staff. "This one's a fighter," the shelter manager had told Sarah. "Special bond with this little guy." From the moment Max entered their home, Ethan had been enchanted. Though just 3 months old, the puppy showed remarkable gentleness with the toddler, patiently enduring clumsy pats and sharing toys with good nature. At night, they would often find Max curled protectively at the foot of Ethan's bed, even though they'd prepared a dog bed in the kitchen. That Wednesday afternoon had begun like any other. Sarah had the day off and was catching up on laundry while Ethan and Max played in the fenced backyard. She could see them through the kitchen window, Ethan stacking plastic blocks while Max pounced on fallen leaves nearby. The scene was so peaceful, so ordinary. "Just 2 minutes," Sarah would later tell the police through tears. "I just went to move clothes from the washer to the dryer, 2 minutes at most." When she returned to the window, the backyard was empty. At first, she wasn't alarmed. Ethan often moved from one spot to another in their large yard. "Ethan?" she called, stepping onto the back porch. "Time for snacks, sweetie." Only silence answered her. A quick scan of the yard revealed nothing. Sarah's heart began to beat faster as she walked the perimeter, calling Ethan's name with increasing urgency. Then she noticed what she'd missed before. The gate to the backyard was open, swinging slightly in the autumn breeze. The same gate she was certain had been latched that morning. "Ethan!" Her voice rose with the first edges of panic. "Max, come here, boy!" She ran to the front yard, scanning the quiet country road, then back around to the side yard. Nothing. Racing inside, she checked every room, every closet, under every bed, places where a toddler might hide for an impromptu game. The house remained silent. With shaking hands, Sarah called Michael, who was at a client meeting 30 minutes away. "I can't find Ethan," she managed, her voice breaking. "The gate was open. Max is gone too." Michael's voice tightened with controlled fear. "I'm on my way. Call 911 right now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. After making the call, Sarah ran back outside, this time heading toward the tree line that marked the beginning of Pinewood Forest. The dense woods began just 50 yards from their property, a vast stretch of wilderness that extended for miles. Standing at the edge, calling her son's name, Sarah felt the first wave of true terror wash over her. The forest in autumn was a tapestry of red and gold, beautiful from a distance but disorienting within. Paths appeared and disappeared among fallen leaves. Landmarks looked similar. Even adults with hiking experience could become turned around. And somewhere in that labyrinth was her 2-year-old son. The first police officer arrived 12 minutes later, followed quickly by 2 more. Patrol cars. Sarah was still searching the property's edge, her voice growing hoarse from calling Ethan's name. The officers immediately began organizing a methodical search, one staying with Sarah while the others began to explore the forest edge. "Does your son wander off often?" the female officer asked gently, notepad in hand. "Never," Sarah insisted. "He knows not to open the gate. He's never even tried before." "And the dog? It's missing too?" "Max? He's just a puppy, 3 months old. They're always together." Michael arrived, his car skidding on the gravel driveway as he slammed to a halt. His face was ashen as he ran to Sarah, pulling her into a tight embrace before speaking urgently to the officers. Within minutes, he too was calling Ethan's name, his deep voice carrying further into the trees than Sarah's could. The afternoon sun was already beginning its descent, casting long shadows through the forest. An officer approached with something in his hand, a small blue toy truck, one of Ethan's favorites. "Found this about 20 yards in," he said, pointing to a barely visible game trail leading into the woods. "Looks like he went this way." Sarah reached for the truck with trembling fingers. It was unmistakably Ethan's, a birthday gift from his grandmother. The plastic was still warm from the sun. "We need more people," the lead officer decided, radio already in hand. "I'm calling in search and rescue, and we'll need dogs," as if, in cruel irony, the mention of dogs reminded them all that little Max was also missing. "Do you think the puppy is with Ethan?" an officer asked. "They're inseparable," Michael said. "If Ethan went into those woods, Max would have followed him." This small fact offered Sarah the first tiny glimmer of hope in the growing nightmare. At least Ethan might not be alone. But the comfort was fleeting as the officer gently explained the reality of their situation. "We've got maybe 3 hours of decent light left. Temperature's going to drop into the low 40s tonight. We need to find them before dark." Search and rescue arrived within the hour, professional faces hiding the urgency they all felt. Time was already becoming their enemy. A toddler alone in the woods as night approached. A puppy too young to offer real protection. As the search parties organized, Sarah clung to the blue truck, its plastic wheels digging into her palm. Somewhere in the deepening shadows of Pinewood Forest, her son was following a path that led away from safety, from home, from her. And with each passing minute, the light grew dimmer, the forest deeper, and the chances of finding Ethan before nightfall slipped further away. As dusk approached, Pinewood Forest transformed from a sunlit woodland into a shadowy maze. The search and rescue team had established a command post in the Carter's front yard with maps spread across the hood of a truck and radios crackling with coordinated movements of search parties. Neighbors began arriving in trucks and SUVs, some bringing spotlights, others with walking sticks and water bottles, all with faces etched with determination to find little Ethan. Sheriff Dan Monroe, a veteran of 27 years with deep lines around his eyes, addressed the growing crowd. "We've divided the search area into quadrants," he explained, pointing to the map. "We know the boy entered the forest here approximately 3 hours ago. Assuming maximum distance for a 2-year-old, our primary search radius is 1 mile. Prestuama. Statement hung heavy in the air. 1 mile in dense forest meant thousands of acres of potential hiding places, fallen logs, thick underbrush, ravines, and rocky outcroppings. "What about the search dogs?" Michael asked, his arm firmly around Sarah's shoulders. "They're on their way from the county seat," the sheriff replied. "Should be here within the hour. In the meantime, we need every available person on the ground." Jimmy Parker, the Carters' nearest neighbor and a retired forest ranger, stepped forward. "This forest can be tricky even for experienced adults," he cautioned. "There's a creek running north to south about half a mile in. If the boy crossed it, he could be anywhere in the eastern section." Search teams were quickly organized, each with a radio, a map, and an assigned quadrant. Sarah insisted on joining, despite the officer's gentle suggestion that she stay at the house in case Ethan found his way back. "I'm going," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "He'll respond to my voice better than anyone's." As the teams prepared to depart, a young deputy approached with a troubled expression. "There's something you should know," he said quietly to the sheriff. "We've had reports of a mountain lion in the Western Ridge area last week, probably just passing through," but the sheriff nodded grimly. "All the more reason to find this boy fast. Make sure every team knows. Noise is good. Talk, call out, keep predators away." This exchange wasn't meant for Sarah's ears, but she caught enough to add another layer of terror to her already overwhelming fear. Not just the cold, not just the dark, but wild animals too. Her mind flashed to Max, tiny brave Max, who would be no match for any predator. What protection could a 3-month-old puppy possibly offer? By 6:30, the first hints of darkness were seeping through the trees as 15 search parties entered the forest from different points. Flashlight beams cut through the growing shadows, voices calling Ethan echoed against ancient trunks. Overhead, the county police helicopter arrived, its spotlight sweeping across the forest canopy. Though all knew its effectiveness would be limited by the dense tree cover, Sarah and Michael joined a team led by Jim Parker, whose knowledge of the forest made him an invaluable guide. As they pushed deeper among the trees, Jim pointed out features: a distinctive boulder, a lightning-struck tree, to help them maintain their bearings. "Kids often follow paths of least resistance," Jim explained as they walked. "Streams, game trails, fallen logs, anything that makes walking easier." They followed a narrow deer trail, calling Ethan's name every few steps. Sarah's throat grew, raw from shouting, but she pushed on, eyes scanning desperately for any sign. A footprint, a scrap of clothing, anything. An hour into the search, their radio crackled with the first potential lead. "Team 7 here. Found what looks like small footprints near the creek bed, heading east." Hope surged through the search parties. Team 7 was nearly half a mile in at the creek Jim had mentioned earlier. If Ethan had indeed reached that point, he'd traveled. An impressive distance for such small legs. "Any sign of dog prints with them?" the sheriff's voice came through. A pause. "Negative. Just the child's prints from what we can tell." Sarah's heart sank. Where was Max? Had the puppy wandered separately, leaving Ethan truly alone? Or were the prints not Ethan's at all? Darkness had fully descended now, transforming the search. What had been challenging in daylight became treacherous by flashlight. Roots waited to trip unwary feet, branches reached out like grasping fingers, and every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. Temperatures began to drop as the night air settled among the trees. By 8 o'clock, the promised search dogs had arrived, 2 Belgian Malinois with their handlers. They were given Ethan's pajamas to sniff, then led to the last known point of entry. The dogs pulled eagerly at first, following some invisible trail, but soon began to circle in confusion, whining with frustration. "Too many scents," one handler explained. "All these searchers have crossed and recrossed the area. And if the boy waited in the creek, the dogs will lose the scent at the water." This news hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had placed so much hope in the dog's abilities. Michael squeezed her hand, his face illuminated in the harsh beam of a flashlight, showing a determination he didn't fully feel. "We'll find him," he promised. "Ethan's smart. He knows to stay put if he's lost." "We've practiced that game," Sarah nodded, clinging to this fragile hope. They had indeed played stay-put games with Ethan, teaching him that if he ever couldn't see mommy or daddy, he should stop and wait for them to find him. But would a 2-year-old remember such lessons in the dark, scary forest? At the command post, additional resources were arriving. Volunteers from surrounding communities, more police officers, even a local news van whose presence underscored the growing seriousness of the situation. The sheriff organized a rotating schedule to ensure continuous search through the night, while emphasizing the need for searchers to stay within their assigned areas. "Getting lost ourselves won't help the boy," he reminded them. As the initial search parties returned to rest and warm up with coffee from thermoses, new teams headed out, fresh voices calling Ethan's name into the darkness. Sarah refused to take a break, moving from one team to another despite her exhaustion. At the edge of the command area, a wildlife officer spoke quietly with the sheriff. "Temperatures dropping faster than predicted. We're looking at upper 30s by midnight. If that boy's not wearing warm clothes..." He didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone knew that hypothermia was now as great a threat as any predator or fall. A toddler's small body would lose heat quickly, especially if he became wet from crossing the creek, or from the dew already forming on the forest floor. As the first hour of darkness stretched into a second, then a third, the initial adrenaline of the search began to give way to a deeper, more persistent dread. Somewhere in the vast darkness of Pinewood Forest, little Ethan was facing the night alone, or perhaps not entirely alone, if one small golden puppy had somehow stayed by his side. Midnight came with a bitter chill that seeped through jackets and gloves. The forest had transformed into an alien landscape where flashlight beams created more shadows than illumination, and familiar landmarks disappeared into the darkness. Search teams rotated every 2 hours now, with exhausted volunteers returning to warm up at the command post, while fresh groups ventured into the woods. Sarah had finally been convinced to take a brief rest, sitting in a folding chair with a thermal blanket around her shoulders and an untouched cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. Her eyes never left the tree line, as if by sheer will she could pierce the darkness and locate her son. "We've covered about 60% of the primary search area," Sheriff Monroe explained to Michael, pointing to marked sections on the map. "At first light, we'll have the helicopter back up with thermal imaging. Works better when the ground's cool and body heat stands out more." Michael nodded mechanically, processing information without emotion, a coping mechanism that allowed him to function when part of him wanted to collapse. "What about the creek area? Those footprints? Team 12 is there now with spotlights. If Ethan followed the creek, we'll find signs." The sheriff paused, choosing his words carefully. "The good news is we haven't found any evidence of an accident. No clothing snagged on branches, no signs of a fall." What remained unspoken hung between them. No evidence of predator activity either. No blood. "No," Michael cut the thought off before it fully formed. Across the yard, local news reporter Melissa Chen was delivering a hushed update to the camera, the search command post visible in the background. The search for 2-year-old Ethan Carter has now entered its 9th hour. Authorities remain hopeful, but concerns are growing as temperatures continue to drop here in Pinewood County. The media presence had grown to 3 news vans, their satellite dishes reaching toward the star-filled sky. The story of a missing toddler had captured public attention, spreading across social media and local news outlets. Offers of help poured in from neighboring counties. Additional search dogs, thermal drones, experienced trackers. As the night deepened, Wildlife Officer Mark Jensen gathered the search team leaders for an important briefing. "I need everyone to understand what we're dealing with," he began, his breath visible in the cold air. "This forest hosts black bears, though most are preparing for winter dormancy now. More concerning are the coyotes, which hunt in packs, and the mountain lion that's been sighted recently." He let the information sink in before continuing. "Predators generally avoid humans, especially groups making noise. But a small child alone might trigger different responses. Your safety protocols remain the same. Make noise, stay in groups, carry your whistles. But if you find the boy, be alert to the surrounding area." The implicit warning added another layer of urgency to an already desperate situation. Sarah, who had moved closer to hear the briefing, pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. The wildlife officer noticed her presence and quickly added, "Predator attacks are extremely rare. I'm just making sure everyone stays safe." But the damage was done. Sarah's mind filled with terrifying images of her small son facing forest predators in the darkness. Only Michael's arm around her shoulders kept her from collapsing. "He has Max," Michael whispered, trying to reassure her and himself. "Animals can sense danger. Maybe Max is helping him somehow." At 2 a.m., Team 5 radioed in with a discovery that sent a surge of hope through the command post. "We've found what looks like a child's footprint by the North Ridge Trail. Fresh, small heel mark in the mud." Every available searcher redirected to this new area, a rocky section approximately 3/4 of a mile from where Ethan had first entered the forest. Sheriff Monroe arrived first with Sarah and Michael close behind, their exhaustion temporarily forgotten. The footprint was unmistakable, a small heel impression in a patch of mud, illuminated now by multiple flashlights. Next to it, barely visible, was another mark that the sheriff identified after careful examination. "Looks like a paw print," he said, pointing to the faint impression. "Small dog, could be your puppy." Sarah dropped to her knees beside the prints, tears streaming down her face. "They're together," she whispered. "Max is still with him." This small revelation transformed the search. Max wasn't just missing alongside Ethan. The puppy was actually traveling with him, perhaps even leading or following protectively. It was the first concrete evidence that Ethan wasn't completely alone in the vast, dark forest. With renewed determination, the search expanded outward from the footprints. Calls for Ethan now included "Max" and "Here, puppy," in hopes that the dog might respond even if Ethan couldn't or wouldn't. Dawn was still 3 hours away, but no one spoke of waiting for daylight. Each passing minute in the cold night reduced Ethan's chances of surviving without injury or worse. The search pressed on with a grim intensity, flashlight beams sweeping across the forest floor, catching the reflective eyes of nocturnal creatures that watched the human intrusion with wary curiosity. Dr. Elena Martinez, a pediatrician who had volunteered to join the search, spoke quietly with the sheriff. "Children his age are more resilient than we sometimes think," she explained. "Their bodies can maintain core temperature better than expected, especially if he's been moving. The concern is if he's wet or if he's stopped moving for a long period." "And the puppy?" the sheriff asked. "Could it make a difference?" "Absolutely," Dr. Martinez confirmed. Body heat from the dog could be significant. Many cases of children surviving extreme conditions involve animals providing warmth. It's not just folklore. This clinical confirmation of what Sarah and Michael desperately wanted to believe offered a thread of hope in the increasingly dire situation. At 3:30 a.m., the temperature reached its lowest point, 35 degrees according to the weather. Stationed at the command post, search teams now carried additional thermal blankets, ready to immediately wrap Ethan if found. A medical helicopter remained on standby at the county airport, prepared for immediate evacuation if necessary. The Carters' home had become the center of a massive operation, with vehicles lining the rural road and generators humming to power, lights, and equipment. Neighbors maintained a constant supply of coffee and food for the searchers, while a local church group had arrived to offer support and prayers for the family. But as the long night hours stretched toward morning, the harsh reality remained unchanged. Somewhere in the vast expanse of pinewood forest, a 2-year-old boy and a 3-month-old puppy faced dangers that would challenge even experienced adults. And with each passing hour, the window for finding them unharmed grew smaller, while the forest kept its secrets wrapped in darkness and silence. Max had never been meant to survive. The runt of an abandoned litter, he had been overlooked by the shelter staff until they noticed his persistent struggle. Tiny paws pushing against his siblings, seeking warmth, seeking life. That fighting spirit had caught Sarah's attention during her volunteer shift. While others saw a scrawny pup with little chance, she saw determination in those amber eyes. "This one," she had said firmly, lifting the small golden puppy from the whelping box. "This one's coming home with us." In the 6 weeks since joining the Carter family, Max had formed a bond with Ethan that went beyond the usual child-pet relationship. Perhaps it was because they were both small in a world of big things. Or perhaps because Ethan's gentle nature matched the puppy's sweet temperament. Whatever the reason, where Ethan went, Max followed. A tiny shadow with oversized paws and floppy ears. On that fateful afternoon, Max had been dozing in a patch of sunlight when something caught his attention, the sound of the backyard gate swinging open. His ears perked up as he watched Ethan toddle toward the opening, drawn by the sight of a bright red cardinal flitting between trees at the yard's edge. The bird was like a flame against the autumn foliage, irresistible to a curious toddler. "Bird," Ethan had called out, pointing with delight. Then, as the cardinal flew deeper into the woods, Ethan had followed without hesitation the open gate, an invitation to adventure. Max had hesitated, looking back toward the house where he knew Sarah was. Dogs understand boundaries, even young ones, and he sensed that Ethan was crossing one that shouldn't be crossed. But the pull of loyalty was stronger than the rule. With a soft whine, he had trotted after the boy. Staying close to the small sneakers that crunched through fallen leaves, the cardinal led them along a natural path between towering trees, always just ahead, always tempting Ethan forward with flashes of red against brown and gold. Max had tried to keep pace, his short legs working twice as hard as Ethan's, his nose cataloging the overwhelming forest smells, earth and decay, animal markings, the sharp tang of pine. When the bird finally disappeared high into the canopy, Ethan had stopped, suddenly aware of unfamiliar surroundings. The house was no longer visible through the trees. The sounds of the backyard, wind chimes on the porch, the distant hum of the road, had been replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of forest birds. "Mama?" Ethan had called, his voice small in the vastness around them. Max had pressed against the boy's legs, offering comfort through contact. He could sense Ethan's shift from curiosity to uncertainty, could smell the first hints of fear in the child's scent. Instinctively, the puppy had licked Ethan's hand, drawing a small giggle that momentarily eased the tension. They had wandered for a while, Ethan calling Mama and Dada with increasing distress, Max trotting alongside. The puppy's senses, though, still developing, were far sharper than the toddler's. He heard movements in the underbrush that Ethan couldn't perceive, smelled animals whose scents made his fur stand on end. When Ethan finally sat down on a fallen log and began to cry, Max had climbed into his lap, all 30 pounds of puppy offering warmth and reassurance. He licked away salty tears until Ethan's sobs subsided into hiccups. Then quiet exhaustion. As afternoon had shifted toward evening, the forest transformed around them. Shadows lengthened, temperatures dropped, and new creatures began to stir. Max's ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds that registered as potential threats in his primitive but effective canine brain. Ethan had grown sleepy as darkness fell, curling up beside the log with thumb in mouth, a self-soothing gesture he had mostly outgrown but reverted to in moments of distress. Max had settled against the boy's back, creating a warm pocket between his furry body and Ethan's jacket. That might have been where searchers found them, if not for the coyotes. Max had heard them first, the distant yipping that signaled pack communication. His body had tensed, an instinctive recognition of danger that predated domestication. When the sounds grew closer, the puppy had made a decision remarkable for his age and limited experience. He had nudged Ethan awake, pushing his cold nose against the boy's cheek with increasing urgency until the toddler sat up, groggy and confused in the gathering darkness. "Max," Ethan had mumbled, reaching for the familiar fur. The puppy had pulled away, moving a few steps into the forest before looking back then returning to tug gently at Ethan's jacket sleeve. The message was clear even to a 2-year-old. "Follow me," half walking, half crawling. Ethan had followed Max away from the fallen log, away from the approaching coyotes. The puppy led them deeper into the forest, but with purpose rather than panic, his nose working constantly to assess their surroundings. They had reached the small creek as full darkness enveloped the forest. The water wasn't deep, just inches in most places, but to Ethan it seemed like a river. He had stopped at the edge, unwilling to step into the cold flow. Max had waded in first, looking back expectantly. When Ethan still hesitated, the puppy had returned to the bank and pressed against the boy's legs, offering support. Together they had crossed, Ethan's sneakers and the bottom half of his pants becoming soaked in the process. On the far bank, Max had shaken vigorously, spraying water droplets that made Ethan giggle despite his fear and discomfort. That small moment of joy had been precious in the growing terror of their situation. As temperature dropped and true night settled over the forest, Max's focus had shifted from movement to shelter. His instincts, though undeveloped, recognized the danger of cold and exposure. With Ethan growing increasingly tired and his wet clothing a serious threat, the puppy had led them to a fallen pine whose branches created a natural lean-to against a rocky outcrop. Ethan had crawled into this shelter without prompting, recognizing its similarity to the blanket forts he built at home. Max followed, pressing his warm body against the shivering child, licking cold fingers and cheeks to stimulate circulation. Throughout that first long night, Max had remained vigilant, while Ethan drifted in and out of fitful sleep. When distant howls echoed through the darkness, the puppy had positioned himself at the entrance to their shelter, a tiny but determined guardian. When small nocturnal creatures rustled too close, Max had issued warning growls that belied his youth and size. And when Ethan cried out for his mother in half-waking moments of fear, Max had snuggled closer, offering the comfort of contact, of heartbeat against heartbeat, of shared warmth in the dangerous cold. At some point during those dark hours, as Ethan's shivering threatened to become uncontrollable, Max had somehow understood that their situation had become dire. With a wisdom that transcended his limited experience, the puppy had curled his body completely around the toddler's torso, becoming a living blanket of fur and warmth. Their breath mingled in the freezing air, one small boy and one small dog, alone in the vastness of pinewood forest, connected by a bond that would be tested with each passing hour of their ordeal. The first hint of dawn arrived as a subtle lightening of the eastern sky, barely perceptible through the forest canopy. Exhausted searchers who had combed the woods throughout the night greeted this new day with mixed emotions. Relief had improved, visibility, but dread at what 12 hours of darkness might have meant for a toddler exposed to the elements. At the command post, Sheriff Monroe studied the updated search map with bloodshot eyes. Colored pins marked areas already covered, creating a patchwork that revealed both progress and the daunting task still ahead. Overnight, the search radius had been expanded to 2 miles, the maximum distance a determined toddler might have traveled in the time available. "We've got fresh teams arriving from Johnson County," his deputy reported, "and the state police helicopter will be back in the air within the hour." The sheriff nodded, massaging his temples. "What's the status on those thermal drones?" "En route. Estimated arrival in 40 minutes. Nearby, Sarah sat rigid in a folding chair, refusing all suggestions that she return to the house to rest. She had not slept, had barely spoken in the past few hours, her entire being focused on the forest that had swallowed her son. Michael paced nearby, pausing occasionally to touch her shoulder or offer water that she rarely drank. Dr. Martinez approached them as the sky continued to lighten. "I want to prepare you," she said gently. "When we find Ethan, he may be suffering." from mild hypothermia. He'll likely be confused, maybe lethargic. But children can be remarkably resilient in these situations. Sarah focused on the doctor's deliberate use of when rather than if. And if he's wet from the creek, Dr. Martinez's expression remained professionally neutral. That would complicate things, yes. But remember, we have evidence the puppy is with him. Animal body heat can make a critical difference. As full daylight finally arrived, revealing a forest shrouded in morning mist, search operations intensified. Fresh volunteers were briefed and deployed, joining the core teams that had worked through the night. The helicopter's distinctive thrum filled the air as it began systematic passes over the search area, its thermal imaging equipment scanning for heat signatures among the trees. Wildlife Officer Jensen gathered a specialized tracking team at the site where the footprint and paw print had been discovered hours earlier. In daylight, we might find signs invisible in the dark, he explained, broken twigs at toddler height, disturbed leaf litter, possibly even clothing fibers. His team moved with methodical precision, eyes trained on the forest floor and understory. Progress was painfully slow, a few yards every minute, but their expertise yielded results others might have missed. Here, called out Donna Mitchell, an experienced volunteer tracker. Drag marks in these leaves, something small being pulled or dragging itself. The team converged, studying the subtle disturbance she had identified, a narrow path where fallen leaves appeared, brushed in a consistent direction. 20 feet further, they found another clue, a small bright blue fiber caught on a bramble. From the boy's jacket, Jensen confirmed, carefully preserving the fiber in an evidence bag. They came this way. This news energized the search. Teams redistributed to focus on the newly identified path, calling Ethan's and Max's names with renewed hope. Media crews repositioned their cameras to capture this development, their live broadcasts drawing more volunteers from surrounding communities. Sarah insisted on joining the tracking team despite her exhaustion. "I need to be there when they find him," she told Michael, her voice hoarse from hours of calling her son's name. "I need him to see me first." As the morning progressed, the trackers identified a pattern to Ethan and Max's movement, not random wandering, but a surprisingly direct line heading northeast, deeper into the forest, but paralleling a series of rocky ridges. "It's almost as if they're following something," Jensen observed, "or being led by something." "The puppy?" Michael suggested. "Could he be guiding Ethan somehow?" Jensen considered this. "It's unusual for such a young dog, but not impossible. Puppies retain more instinctual knowledge than we sometimes credit them with. And golden retrievers specifically have natural guiding tendencies, even without training." This possibility that Max might be actively helping rather than merely accompanying Ethan spread through the search parties, offering a narrative of hope in the increasingly desperate situation. By mid-morning, temperatures had risen to a more comfortable 50 degrees, alleviating some concerns about hypothermia. But other worries intensified with each passing hour: dehydration, hunger, injury from a fall, or encounter with wildlife. The tracking team's progress stalled at the edge of a rocky clearing, where the soft forest floor gave way to stone, eliminating any readable signs. 3 potential paths led away from this point, forcing a difficult decision about how to proceed. "We'll split up," Jensen decided. 3 teams, 3 directions. Sarah and Michael joined the central team, following a narrow game trail that wound between granite boulders. The forest character changed here. Fewer deciduous trees, more pines and hemlocks, creating deep pools of shade even in daylight. 2 hours later, with the search now approaching the 24-hour mark, exhaustion began taking its toll on even the most determined searchers. Mistakes became more common. Missed radio calls, overlooked terrain features, minor injuries from falls on uneven ground. At the command post, Sheriff Monroe made a difficult decision. "We need to rotate everyone out for rest periods, even family members," he instructed his deputies. 4 hours on, 2 hours mandatory rest, no exceptions. When this directive reached Sarah and Michael, they initially resisted. "I'm not stopping," Sarah insisted, her voice breaking. "Every minute counts." It took Dr. Martinez's gentle intervention to convince her. "You need to be functional when we find him," the doctor explained. "Ethan will need you strong, not collapsed from exhaustion." Reluctantly, the Carters agreed to brief rest periods, though neither could actually sleep when their turns came. Instead, they lay in their bedroom, now a strange island of normalcy in a house transformed into crisis headquarters, staring at the ceiling or at Ethan's photos on the walls. During one such rest period, Michael finally voiced the fear that had been growing inside him. "What if we don't find him, Sarah? What if—" "Don't," she cut him off sharply. "Don't say it. Don't even think it." Her eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, fixed on her husband with fierce intensity. "He's out there. He's alive. Max is with him." Michael nodded, swallowing the dark thoughts that 24 sleepless hours had nurtured. He had to believe, for Sarah, for Ethan, for his own sanity. He had to believe that somewhere in the not vast forest, their little boy was still waiting to be found. Outside their window, the search continued unabated, voices calling, radios crackling, the helicopter making another pass. The machinery of hope working relentlessly against the ticking clock of reality. As the search entered its second day, Dr. Karen Wilson arrived at the command post. An animal behaviorist from the State University, she had heard about the missing boy and his puppy companion on the morning news and driven immediately to offer her expertise. "I've studied cases where domestic animals have protected humans in survival situations," she explained to Sheriff Monroe. "If the puppy and child are indeed traveling together, understanding their potential dynamics might help narrow the search." The sheriff, willing to consider any approach that might help, introduced Dr. Wilson to the search coordinators and the Carter family. Her calm, analytical presence provided new perspective to a team increasingly weighted by emotional exhaustion. "Tell me about Max," Dr. Wilson asked Sarah and Michael. "His personality, behaviors, any training he's received." Despite her exhaustion, Sarah managed to focus. "He's protective of Ethan, always has been. Follows him everywhere, for training, just basic commands. Sit, stay, come. But he's smart, picks things up quickly. Any particular behaviors when he's anxious or frightened?" Michael considered this. "He doesn't bark much, even when startled. More likely to press against our legs or try to make himself small." Dr. Wilson nodded, making notes. "What about water? How does he react to streams, puddles, bath time?" "He loves water," Sarah replied. "We can barely keep him out of Ethan's bath. And he tried to swim in a neighbor's pond once, though he's still too young to do it well." This information seemed particularly relevant to Dr. Wilson. "Goldies are natural water dogs," she explained. "Even as puppies, they're drawn to it, can locate it instinctively. If Max and Ethan needed water, which they would after hours in the forest, the puppy might have led them to it." Wildlife Officer Jensen joined the conversation. "There's a network of seasonal springs throughout this section of the forest. Most aren't on regular maps, but local animals use them extensively." This insight sparked a new search approach. Using specialized forestry maps, Jensen identified several natural springs within the expanded search radius. These became priority targets, with teams redirected to check each location. Dr. Wilson continued her analysis. "Another factor to consider is the puppy's age. At 3 months, Max is still very much a baby himself. He wouldn't have the stamina for continuous movement, especially while stressed." "Meaning?" the sheriff prompted. "They've likely taken shelter for extended periods, and given the cold overnight temperatures, they would seek the most insulated location available: brush piles, hollow logs, rocky overhangs." This aligned with Jensen's experience. "We should be checking every natural shelter feature, focusing on south-facing slopes where they'd get morning sun for warmth." The search adjusted again, with teams now examining each potential shelter site within their quadrants. It was slow, painstaking work, requiring searchers to physically check inside fallen logs, under rock outcroppings, beneath dense thickets. By early afternoon, the combined search force had swelled to over 200 people, including specialized teams from neighboring counties and state agencies. The forest echoed with calls for Ethan and Max, the sound sometimes harmonizing into an eerie chorus that seemed to pulse through the trees. Sarah and Michael had rejoined the search after their mandated rest, moving with a determination that belied their physical and emotional exhaustion. They worked alongside Jensen's tracking team, who continued to find occasional signs of passage: a disturbed patch of moss, another small fiber from Ethan's clothing, a partial footprint in a patch of mud duct. Wilson accompanied them, observing the forest through the lens of her expertise in animal behavior. Puppies Max's age still have strong denning instincts, she explained as they moved. If they found themselves lost as night fell, he might have sought an enclosed, protected space. At a rocky outcropping, the tracking team discovered something significant: several golden dog hairs caught in a crevice between boulders. Forensic confirmation would take time, but the color and texture appeared consistent with Max's coat. They were here, Jensen confirmed, carefully collecting the hairs. Question is when and where did they go next? Dr. Wilson surveyed the area, noting the southern exposure and natural windbreak provided by the rock formation. This would have been a logical shelter for their first night, but they would have moved on, searching for water and instinctively trying to find their way home. As the team continued their methodical search beyond the rocks, a call came through on Jensen's radio that electrified everyone within hearing distance. Base to all teams. We have a confirmed sighting of disturbed ground and what appears to be a child's handprint near Spring Location 3. All available units redirect to these coordinates. Spring Location 3 was nearly a mile from their current position in a low-lying area where several seasonal creeks converged. If Ethan and Max had indeed reached this point, they had traveled an impressive distance for their respective sizes and ages. Sarah broke into a run before anyone could stop her, Michael close behind. Team members called for them to wait to preserve their energy for the difficult terrain ahead, but parental instinct overrode all rational considerations. Dr. Wilson shared a concerned look with Jensen. If that handprint is recent, they're still moving. After almost 30 hours in the forest, that's both encouraging and concerning. Encouraging because they're mobile, concerning because they're getting further from the original search area, Jensen translated. Exactly. And a moving target is much harder to intercept. At Spring Location 3, a growing crowd of searchers gathered around a small clearing where a clear impression stood out in the soft mud. A child's handprint, small fingers splayed, as if the child had steadied himself while bending to drink, or had fallen forward onto his hands. Nearby, multiple paw prints indicated a dog had circled the area repeatedly. Most telling was a set of tracks leading away from the spring, human and canine side by side, heading northwest deeper into the forest. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the handprint, tears streaming down her face as she reached out to touch the impression her son had left behind. "He was here," she whispered. "Ethan was right here." Forensic technicians carefully measured and photographed the prints, estimating their age at approximately 4 to 6 hours old, meaning Ethan and Max had been at this location early that morning. A new energy infused the search teams. The prints confirmed what everyone had desperately hoped, that both boy and puppy were still alive and mobile after more than a day in the wilderness. However, the direction of travel raised new concerns. "They're heading deeper into the forest," Jensen observed, "away from roads and inhabited areas, almost as if they're being drawn towards something, or away from something some thought but didn't say." As teams regrouped to follow this new trail, Dr. Wilson raised an important consideration. After this long without food, both Ethan and Max will be significantly weakened. Their pace will slow, their decision-making impaired. We may be dealing with a rapidly closing window of opportunity. This assessment, though clinically delivered, sent a chill through those who heard it. The race to find Ethan and Max had become even more urgent. No longer just a search, but a rescue mission with time as the enemy. Sheriff Monroe made a difficult decision. We're going to concentrate all resources along this new track. If they maintained this direction and pace, we can calculate a probable search area. This meant abandoning other search quadrants, a risky move if the tracks proved misleading. But with limited resources and growing concerns about Ethan and Max's condition, focus had become essential as the repositioned search moved forward following the northwest trajectory indicated by the tracks. Hope and fear traveled with them. In equal measure, hope renewed by concrete evidence of survival. Fear fueled by the knowledge that even the strongest little boys and bravest puppies had limits to their endurance. Ethan was thirsty. His small body, pushed beyond normal limits, craved water with an intensity that overrode even his hunger and fear. The morning sun had warmed him after the long, cold night curled against Max in the hollow beneath a fallen tree. But now, as midday approached, thirst dominated his awareness. "Water," he mumbled, the word thick in his dry mouth. "Max, water." The puppy, trotting ahead on the barely visible game trail, looked back at his small human companion. Max, too, was feeling the effects of their ordeal. His normally bouncy step had slowed, his golden coat dulled with dirt and forest debris. But his instincts remained sharp, driving him to lead rather than follow. Their second day in the forest had begun with Ethan's whimpers of hunger, which Max could do nothing to satisfy. But water the puppy understood. The spring they had found hours earlier had allowed them both to drink deeply, temporarily reviving their energy. Now that resource was far behind them, and thirst was returning. Ethan stumbled, his exhausted legs catching on an exposed root. He didn't cry out. His voice had grown quieter with each passing hour, his usual toddler chatter reduced to essential words and whimpers. Max returned to his side immediately, pressing against his leg in silent support. "Mama," Ethan whispered, the word both question and plea. "Find Mama." Max couldn't understand the specific word, but he recognized the distress in his human's voice, the longing for home and safety. He licked Ethan's hand, his rough tongue offering momentary comfort. They continued their journey, moving in a pattern that had developed over their time in the forest. Ethan walking until exhaustion overtook him, then resting while Max maintained vigilant guard. The puppy's senses, though still developing, were exponentially sharper than the toddler's, alerting him to potential dangers before they materialized. Twice already, Max had steered them away from areas where his nose detected predator scents, too strong for comfort. Once he had placed himself between Ethan and a curious raccoon, his small body projecting a protective ferocity that belied his youth and size. As afternoon approached, the forest terrain began to change, sloping downward toward a shallow valley. Ethan's steps grew more unsteady on the declining path, his depleted energy making coordination difficult. Max adjusted his pace, staying closer to the boy, occasionally gripping the bottom of Ethan's jacket with gentle teeth to steady him on. Steeper sections. At the bottom of the slope, their persistence was rewarded. Another small stream gurgled over smooth stones, creating miniature waterfalls and pools. Ethan dropped to his knees at the water's edge, plunging his hands into the cold flow and bringing them to his mouth with desperate thirst. Max drank alongside him, then shook himself, spraying water droplets that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. This small, familiar action drew a weak giggle from Ethan, the first happy sound he'd made in many hours. Their thirst satisfied, exhaustion took precedence. Ethan curled up on a patch of moss near the stream, his thumb finding his mouth in the self-soothing gesture he'd been using with increasing frequency. Max settled beside him, his body heat a comfort against the afternoon chill that persisted in the shaded valley. While Ethan drifted into fitful sleep, Max remained alert, ears swiveling to track forest sounds, nose testing the air currents. At one point, he raised his head sharply, catching a distant sound that his developing brain couldn't quite identify. Human voices calling, though too far away to be more than faint echoes. The puppy whined softly, some instinct telling him those distant sounds meant safety. But Ethan slept on, too exhausted to be roused, and Max's loyalty wouldn't allow him to leave the boy's side. As Ethan slept, his small body worked to conserve energy, slowing his metabolism in response to extended hunger. His survival instincts, more primitive but just as effective as Max's, had kicked in hours ago, reducing movement when possible, seeking water regularly, using the puppy's warmth to maintain body temperature. A nutritionist would have explained that Ethan's well-fed body had reserves to sustain him through this ordeal, his chubby toddler limbs containing energy stores that could keep him alive for days, though not without discomfort and eventually more serious effects. A child psychologist would have noted his regression to infant behaviors, thumb-sucking, simplified speech, increased physical contact seeking, as stress responses that actually helped him cope with the situation, but no experts were present. In this quiet forest valley, just a small boy and his puppy, both drawing on instincts and bonds deeper than their limited experience. When Ethan woke an hour later, the sun had shifted, casting longer shadows through the trees. His brief rest had restored some energy, but hunger gnawed at his stomach with increasing intensity. He reached for Max, burying his fingers in the puppy's fur. "Hungry," he said simply, the word somewhere between statement and question. Max understood the tone, if not the specific need. He stood, shaking himself fully awake, then moved a few steps upstream, looking back expectantly. Ethan followed, trusting the puppy's guidance as he had throughout their journey. The stream led them to a clearing where late-season blackberry bushes grew in a tangled mass. Most berries were gone, consumed by forest creatures or withered on the vine, but some remained, overripe, soft, but edible. Instinctively, Ethan reached for these familiar fruits, staining his fingers and lips purple as he consumed the meager but welcome nourishment. Max watched, unable to share this particular food source, but seemingly pleased by Ethan's improved mood. When the accessible berries were gone, they continued following the stream, their pace slightly improved after food, water, and rest. As afternoon faded toward evening, new challenges emerged. The temperature began its daily descent, and clouds gathering overhead threatened rain. Ethan, still inadequately dressed for extended outdoor exposure, began to shiver. Max pressed closer to him as they walked, offering what warmth he could. Their path now followed the widening stream, which flowed through increasingly rocky terrain. Twice Ethan slipped on wet stones, once falling hard enough to scrape his palm. The second fall brought tears, silent at first, then building into exhausted sobs that echoed his physical and emotional depletion. Max responded with increasing concern, licking the tears from Ethan's face. Nudging him to continue when the boy would have simply curled up on the ground. Some instinct told the puppy that remaining in motion was important, that finding better shelter before darkness fell was crucial to their survival. With gentle persistence, Max urged Ethan forward until they reached a formation of large boulders. Near the stream, water had eroded the earth beneath one massive rock, creating a small cave-like space just large enough for a toddler and puppy to crawl inside. Max entered first, inspecting the space, then returned to guide Ethan into this natural shelter. Inside, protected from wind and the first light raindrops beginning to fall, Ethan curled into a tight ball. Max settled against him, their shared body heat creating a pocket of warmth in the growing chill. The puppy's ears remained alert, his eyes fixed on the shelter entrance, his body positioned between Ethan and the outside world. as darkness enveloped the forest for the second night, bringing with it the sounds of nocturnal creatures awakening. Max maintained his protective vigil. His young body craved sleep, but something more powerful kept him watchful. A responsibility he couldn't have named, but felt to his core. Ethan's breathing eventually settled into the deep rhythm of exhausted sleep, one hand still clutching a fistful of Max's fur as if afraid the puppy might disappear. Outside their small shelter, rain began to fall more steadily, creating a natural barrier of sound and scent that further isolated them from both predators and rescuers. Somewhere in the vast forest, voices continued to call their names. Flashlights swept through the growing darkness, and the desperate search pressed on against increasingly difficult conditions. Rain fell steadily through the night, transforming the forest floor into a mosaic of puddles and mud. Search operations continued despite the worsening conditions, but progress slowed considerably as visibility decreased and terrain became treacherous. By midnight, Sheriff Monroe faced a difficult decision: continue the increasingly dangerous nighttime search or pull back and resume at first light with renewed resources. "I understand the urgency," he told Sarah and Michael in the command tent, rain drumming on the canvas above them. "But I've got volunteers falling in ravines, twisting ankles, getting disoriented in this weather. If my searchers become casualties, we lose our ability to find your son." Sarah, who had refused to leave the search area despite being drenched and exhausted, shook her head vehemently. "You can't stop. He's out there in this." Her voice broke on the last word, the reality of Ethan facing this same punishing rain too terrible to contemplate. Dr. Martinez, who had remained to monitor Carter's condition, intervened gently. "Sarah, Ethan's core temperature has actually been safer during the day than overnight. Right now, this rain is the primary threat, and children find shelter instinctively. And Max," Dr. Wilson added. "The puppy would seek shelter from rain, potentially guiding Ethan to it as well." After intense discussion, a compromise was reached. Specialized teams with wilderness experience would continue searching key areas through the night, while volunteers would rest and return at dawn. The Carters would finally return to their home for a few hours of desperately needed sleep, with the promise of immediate notification if any developments occurred. As they reluctantly prepared to leave the command post, Jim Parker, the retired forest ranger, approached with a large topographical map. "Been studying this all evening," he said, spreading the map on a table. "And something's been bothering me about the direction they're traveling." Everyone gathered around as Parker traced his finger along the northwest trajectory indicated by the tracks found earlier. "At first glance, it seems they're heading deeper into wilderness, away from civilization. But," his finger continued along the line, then tapped a point several miles ahead. "If they maintain this exact heading, they'd eventually hit Parker's Creek, which leads directly to Johnson Lake." "The fishing camp," Jensen said, recognition dawning on his face. Parker nodded. "Exactly. Popular spot in summer. Closed for the season now, but there are permanent structures, cabins, a main lodge, boat docks." Michael leaned closer. "But how would they know to head that way? Ethan's never been there." "Not about knowledge," Dr. Wilson interjected, studying the map with sudden interest. "It's about instinct and sensory information. Moving water creates negative ions that can be sensed. Valleys channel sounds in ways that might draw them, and animals often follow paths of least resistance through terrain." Sheriff Monroe considered this new theory. "You're suggesting they might be unintentionally heading toward the lake?" "I'm saying it's possible," Parker replied, "and if they are, that's where we should concentrate resources." This new possibility injected fresh energy into the search coordination. Teams already in the field were redirected toward the creek that would eventually lead to Johnson Lake, while plans were made for a major push along this route at first light. The Carters finally agreed to return home, though neither expected to sleep. As Michael drove them through the rain-slicked road, Sarah stared out the window at the impenetrable darkness of the forest, imagining her son somewhere within its depths. "He's smart," she whispered, as much to herself as to Michael. "And he has Max. They're together." Back at the command post, technology provided an unexpected breakthrough. The thermal drones, grounded earlier by the rain, had captured footage just before the weather deteriorated that technicians were now carefully analyzing. "There," a specialist said, pointing to a faint heat signature on the enhanced imagery. "Too small for a deer, wrong shape for typical forest wildlife." Jensen leaned closer. "Can you enhance it further?" After several minutes of technical adjustments, the image became clearer, what appeared to be two heat signatures in close proximity, one smaller than the other, moving slowly between trees approximately 2 miles northwest of the last confirmed tracks. "Coordinates?" Sheriff Monroe asked, already reaching for his radio. The location was quickly pinpointed and transmitted to teams in the field. The closest searchers, led by Parker himself, were still nearly a mile from the sighting, battling difficult terrain made worse by continuing rain. "We're on it," Parker's voice crackled through the radio, "moving as fast as conditions allow." The rain finally began to ease around 3 a.m., though low clouds continued to prevent helicopter operations. As false dawn approached, that liminal time when night begins to surrender but daylight hasn't yet arrived, Parker's team radioed in with news that electrified the command post. "We found clear tracks, small human footprints and dog prints alongside, heading toward the creek. Fresh, made after the rain stopped." Sheriff Monroe immediately called the Carter home. Michael answered on the first ring, his voice tight with anticipation. "We have new tracks," the sheriff told him, "very recent. They survived the night and they're still moving." Within 20 minutes, Sarah and Michael had returned to the command post, their exhaustion temporarily forgotten. The Beaufort map now showed the new location significantly closer to Parker's Creek than previous sightings. "They've covered remarkable ground," Dr. Wilson observed, "especially considering their size and the conditions," Jensen agreed. "At this pace, they could reach the creek by midday." With daylight approaching, search resources were repositioned to create a series of teams along the creek and moving inward toward Ethan and Max's projected path. If the boy and puppy maintained their direction, searchers would intercept them before they reached the water. The operation now took on characteristics of a military movement: precise coordinates, timed deployments, careful positioning of teams to maximize coverage without duplicating efforts. Helicopter crews prepared for immediate launch once cloud ceilings lifted, while drone operators plotted new flight paths to scan the most probable areas. Sarah and Michael joined the team that would move directly toward the last known tracks, accompanied by a paramedic equipped with specialized pediatric emergency supplies. Dr. Wilson came as well, her expertise potentially crucial for managing Max's behavior during the rescue. "The puppy may have become protective of Ethan," she cautioned, as they prepared to depart. "He might view rescuers as threats. We'll need to approach carefully." As the search teams moved out into the lightning forest, the rain had transformed. The landscape, streams ran fuller, new rivulets carved paths down slopes, mud made each step treacherous. But these same conditions created an unexpected advantage. Tracking became easier, with fresh footprints preserved clearly in the soft ground. Parker's experienced eye spotted the signs first: a small depression in mud beside the newly swollen creek, the distinct imprint of a child's shoe with a cartoon character tread that matched the description of Ethan's sneakers. Nearby, the unmistakable paw prints of a small dog circled and overlapped, showing how Max had paced around Ethan at this spot. "They were here very recently," Parker confirmed, touching the impressions gently. "Water hasn't filled these prints yet. Maybe an hour ago, no more." This news traveled quickly through radio channels, energizing every searcher. After almost 40 hours lost in the wilderness, Ethan and Max were not only surviving, They were actively moving with apparent purpose, following the creek that would eventually lead to Johnson Lake. For the first time since the ordeal began, hope outweighed fear in Sarah's heart. As the rising sun finally broke through clouds, casting golden light through rain-washed leaves, she felt with sudden conviction that this day would not end without her son in her arms. "We're coming, Ethan," she whispered to the forest around her. "Mommy's coming. Just hold on a little longer." Beside her, Michael squeezed her hand, his own face reflecting the same cautious hope. Somewhere ahead, no longer impossibly distant, their son was waiting to be found. Dawn brought clarity to the forest, rain-washed air, jewel-like droplets suspended from every leaf, and a sense of renewal that seemed to mirror the searchers' restored hope. The creek, swollen from overnight rain, guided them forward along the path Ethan and Max appeared to be following. Sarah moved with single-minded focus, her eyes scanning constantly for any sign of her son. Despite 40 hours without real sleep, adrenaline and maternal determination kept her moving steadily through the difficult terrain. Michael stayed close beside her, occasionally steadying her on slippery slopes, his own exhaustion masked by purpose. "Fresh tracks," Parker called out, kneeling beside a muddy patch near the creek bank. "Small shoe print, paw prints alongside, heading that way." He pointed toward a bend in the creek where large boulders created a natural ford. The team quickened their pace following this newest sign. Dr. Wilson studied the tracks with professional interest. "The dog is staying remarkably close to the child," she observed. "These prints overlap repeatedly. He's not just accompanying Ethan, he's actively guiding him." This assessment, confirming what many had begun to suspect, added another layer to the already extraordinary narrative. A 3-month-old puppy, himself little more than a baby, somehow providing leadership through a wilderness ordeal. As they rounded the bend in the creek, the terrain opened into a small clearing, where the water widened into a shallow pool before continuing its journey. Parker suddenly raised his hand, signaling for silence. "Listen," he whispered. Everyone froze, straining to hear through the ambient sounds of forest and flowing water. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Bird calls, the gurgle of the creek, wind in the trees. Then, faint but unmistakable, a sound that stopped Sarah's heart mid-beat, barking. Not the distant bark of a hunting dog or the howl of a wild canine, but the high-pitched, insistent bark of a very young dog, and it was coming from somewhere ahead, beyond the pool. "Max," Sarah breathed, her voice barely audible. The team moved forward with renewed urgency, no longer calling out as they had been throughout the search. If the puppy was barking, there was a chance, incredible as it seemed, that he was trying to signal for help. The barking grew louder as they approached a section of the creek where fallen trees created a natural debris dam. Water flowed around and through this obstacle, creating small whirlpools and eddies. Parker pointed to the far side of the creek. "Over there, among those roots." On the opposite bank, a massive oak had partially fallen, its root system exposed, and creating a tangled wall of earth and wood. The barking was coming from within this natural fortress. Without hesitation, Sarah plunged into the creek, water rising to her thighs as she crossed the slippery bed. Michael followed immediately, with Parker and Dr. Wilson close behind. The paramedic grabbed his medical kit and joined the crossing, while other team members spread out to secure the perimeter. As they reached the far bank, the barking intensified, sharper, more urgent. Sarah scrambled up the muddy incline toward the exposed roots, calling out for the first time since hearing the barks. "Max, Ethan, we're here." The barking stopped abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched whine. Sarah reached the root wall and dropped to her knees, peering into the dark spaces between twisted wood and earth. There, in a hollow created by the partially uprooted tree, a pair of amber eyes reflected the morning light. Max, his golden coat muddied almost beyond recognition, standing protectively at the entrance to a small cave-like space. Max, Sarah called softly, extending her hand slowly. Good boy, good boy. The puppy whined again but didn't move from his position. Behind Sarah, Dr. Wilson offered quiet guidance. He's guarding something or someone. Move slowly, speak gently, let him recognize you. Sarah edged closer, speaking in the soothing tones she used at home. Max, it's Mommy, good boy. Where's Ethan? Where's our boy? At the sound of Ethan's name, Max's demeanor changed. His tail, previously tucked, gave a slight wag. He barked once more, then turned to look behind him into the dark hollow. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for her flashlight and directed its beam into the space. The light revealed what Max had been so faithfully protecting. Ethan, curled in a tight ball inside the hollow, his blue jacket smeared with mud, his eyes closed. Ethan! The word tore from Sarah's throat, equal parts joy and terror. Was he? As if in answer, the small form stirred at the sound of his mother's voice. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, squinting against the sudden light. Mama? His voice was weak, raspy from dehydration, but the single word carried clearly to every searcher present. Sarah scrambled forward, heedless of the mud and sharp roots. Max finally moved aside, his guardian duty fulfilled as Sarah reached her son. With gentle hands, she touched his face, his arms, reassuring herself that he was real, that he was whole. I'm here, baby. Mommy's here. We found you. Michael reached them seconds later, his composed facade finally crumbling as he saw his son alive. He wrapped his arms around both Sarah and Ethan, creating a family circle that had seemed impossibly broken just moments before. The paramedic approached carefully, professional training taking over despite the emotional scene. I need to check. Him, he said gently. Reluctantly, Sarah loosened her hold, allowing the paramedic access while keeping Ethan's hand firmly in her own. The examination was quick but thorough. Vital signs, temperature, responsiveness, signs of injury. He's dehydrated and his temperature's a bit low, but remarkably stable considering, the paramedic reported. No obvious injuries beyond minor scrapes and bruises. We need to get him to a hospital, but he's in surprisingly good condition. Max remained close by, watchful despite his evident exhaustion. Dr. Wilson examined the puppy with experienced hands. He's dehydrated too, but otherwise seems okay, she concluded. What he's done is extraordinary. As they prepared Ethan for transport, wrapping him in thermal blankets and preparing an IV for fluid replacement, the full story began to emerge through Ethan's halting words and the physical evidence around them. Max, find water, Ethan told them, pointing weakly toward the creek. Max barked at scary things. The hollow where they had sheltered showed signs of extended occupation. Disturbed earth, where Max had clearly dug to expand the space, leaf litter, gathered in one corner that appeared to have served as bedding. Most telling were the chewed branches nearby with tooth marks at puppy height. Max had apparently tried to create additional barriers around their shelter. He protected me, Ethan said, his small hand reaching for the puppy who had not left his side, despite the arrival of human rescuers. As the rescue team carefully extracted Ethan from the hollow and prepared him for the journey back, Sheriff Monroe's voice came through on the radio, emotion breaking through his professional tone. Confirmed status? Is the child? Parker replied, his own voice thick. Child found alive. Repeat, child found alive and stable. Puppy too, both in remarkable condition given circumstances. The cheer that erupted at the command post could be heard even through the small radio speaker. 42 hours after disappearing into the forest, Ethan Carter had been found, not just alive, but largely unharmed thanks to the extraordinary actions of a puppy who had somehow understood that his small human needed protection, guidance, and warmth to survive. As they began the careful journey back, Ethan secure in his father's arms while Sarah carried the exhausted Max. The first helicopter appeared overhead, rotors thumping against the morning sky. News of the miracle rescue was already spreading, racing across radio channels, phone lines, and news alerts. A 2-year-old boy and a 3-month-old puppy had survived nearly 2 days and 2 nights in wilderness conditions that would challenge even experienced adults. And they had done it together, their bond transcending the limitations of species, age, and communication. Against all odds, they were going home. The pediatric emergency room at County Memorial Hospital buzzed with controlled urgency as doctors and nurses worked efficiently around Ethan. Despite the team's professional composure, an undercurrent of amazement ran through their actions. Children lost in wilderness conditions for nearly 2 days rarely arrived in such relatively good condition. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the pediatric emergency specialist, completed her examination and turned to Sarah and Michael, who hadn't left their son's side since the rescue. He's dehydrated, as we expected, and his body temperature is lower than optimal, but not dangerously so, she explained. Some minor abrasions, a few bruises, and early signs of exposure, but nothing severe. Honestly, it's remarkable, Sarah nodded. Her eyes fixed on Ethan, who lay drowsily on the treatment bed, an IV delivering fluids to his small body. Max kept him warm, she said simply, as if this explained everything. In many ways, it did. The medical team had been briefed on the extraordinary circumstances of Ethan's survival, and while their training focused on scientific explanations, none could deny the significance of the puppy's role. "Where is Max now?" Dr. Chen asked. "The emergency vet is checking him," Michael replied. "They're bringing him here as soon as they're done. Ethan keeps asking for him." As if on cue, Ethan's eyes fluttered open, immediately scanning the room. "Max," he asked, his voice stronger after the initial fluid treatment. "He's coming, sweetie," Sarah assured him, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "The animal? Doctor is making sure he's okay, just like Dr. Chen is making sure you're okay." This seemed to satisfy Ethan, who relaxed back against the pillows. Over the next hour, the medical team continued their work. Blood tests, more fluids, gentle, cleaning of scratches, and application of antibiotic ointment. Through it all, Ethan remained remarkably cooperative, though he occasionally asked for Max with increasing insistence. In the animal hospital wing of the same medical center, Max was receiving similarly thorough care. Dr. Wilson had accompanied, the puppy providing insights to the veterinary team about his behavior during the ordeal. "He's dehydrated, but otherwise in surprisingly good shape," the veterinarian reported after examination. "Some minor paw pad abrasions, slight weight loss, but no serious injuries. He's a very resilient little guy." "More than resilient, Doctor," Wilson replied, watching as the vet tech gently cleaned mud from Max's golden coat. "What he did goes beyond normal canine behavior, especially for a puppy so young. He not only stayed with Ethan, but actively protected him, guided him to water, even created shelter. The behavioral complexity is extraordinary," the veterinarian nodded thoughtfully. "There are documented cases of dogs protecting children, but usually they involve mature animals with established bonds. For a 12-week-old puppy to show this level of protective behavior..." He shook his head in wonder. Once Max had received fluids and his immediate needs were addressed, permission was granted to reunite him with Ethan. A hospital administrator initially objected to allowing an animal in the pediatric unit, but Dr. Chen overruled the concern. In this case, separating them could cause psychological distress to both, she argued. The puppy is effectively part of the treatment plan. When Max was carried into Ethan's room, the transformation in the toddler was immediate and profound. His entire body relaxed as the freshly cleaned puppy was placed carefully beside him on the bed. Max immediately snuggled against Ethan's side, mirroring the position they had maintained for warmth throughout their ordeal. "Max, good dog," Ethan said, burying his fingers in the puppy's fur. "Max, save Ethan." The simple declaration, delivered with a child's unfiltered honesty, brought tears to every adult present. Even Dr. Chen, trained to maintain professional distance, found herself blinking rapidly as she checked Ethan's vital signs. By evening, Ethan's condition had improved enough that he could take small amounts of food and drink. The hospital had prepared a special room where Sarah and Michael could remain overnight with their son, a cot placed alongside the pediatric bed. Max, officially designated as a therapeutic companion after Dr. Wilson's intervention, was allowed to stay as well. As night fell, the media gathered outside the hospital had grown to a small army, local stations, national networks, even international correspondents attracted by the compelling narrative of a toddler saved by a puppy. Hospital security maintained a protective cordon, while the administration handled press inquiries with carefully worded updates. The Carter family appreciates the public's concern and well wishes, the hospital spokesperson announced in the evening briefing. Ethan is stable and responding well to treatment. They ask for privacy as they focus on his recovery. What the spokesperson couldn't share, were the quiet moments unfolding in Ethan's room, where the full story was emerging, in pieces through the toddler's limited vocabulary and the physical evidence documented by the search team. Max find water, Ethan explained when asked how they had managed to drink. Max, dig. Sarah and Michael listened in wonder as their son described in simple terms how Max had led him to streams and springs, how the puppy had seemed to know which berries were safe to eat, how he had barked to scare away scary animals in the night. Max warm, Ethan added, patting the puppy who hadn't left his side. When cold, Max warm Ethan. Dr. Martinez, who had stopped by to check on the family, explained the significance of this shared warmth. In survival situations, hypothermia is often the greatest danger, especially for small children who lose heat quickly. Having Max's body heat consistently available likely made the critical difference. Outside Ethan's room, Sheriff Monroe met briefly with the Carters to provide an update on the investigation into how Ethan had managed to leave the yard in the first place. The gate latch was faulty, he explained gently. It appears to close properly, but can pop open with minimal pressure. Just bad luck that Ethan discovered this vulnerability. Sarah nodded, accepting this explanation without the guilt and recrimination that had haunted her since Ethan's disappearance. The sheriff continued with news that brought fresh tears to her eyes. The search volunteers have started a collection for a new security fence around your property. Local contractors are donating labor to install it next week. This outpouring of community support extended beyond practical assistance. The hospital's reception desk had been inundated with cards, stuffed animals, and gifts for Ethan. More touching were the donations of puppy food, toys, and a custom dog bed for Max, along with offers of free veterinary care for life from several local animal hospitals. As the evening progressed, Ethan's room grew quiet. The toddler, exhausted despite his improving condition, drifted to sleep with Max curled against him. Sarah and Michael sat nearby, holding hands in the dim light, the rhythmic beeping of monitoring equipment, a reassuring backdrop. I keep thinking about how close we came to losing him, Sarah whispered. If Max hadn't been there, Michael squeezed her hand. But he was there. Somehow, that little puppy knew exactly what Ethan needed. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, nothing like the downpour that had complicated the search, just a soft patter against the windows. In his sleep, Ethan reached for Max, a reflexive gesture born of their time together in the wilderness. The puppy responded by snuggling closer, his small body still fulfilling its self-appointed role as protector. Tomorrow would bring more medical evaluations, more questions, more media attention to the miracle story that had captured hearts across the country. But for tonight, in the quiet hospital room, the miracle was simply this: a family reunited, a bond forged in survival, and the extraordinary capacity of even the youngest hearts to care for one another. 1 month after the rescue, the Carter home had transformed in subtle but significant ways. A new fence surrounded the property, its gate equipped with a child-proof lock and alarm system. Inside, photographs documenting Ethan and Max's story covered one wall. Newspaper clippings, professional portraits, candid shots capturing their deepening bond. Ethan had recovered with the resilience characteristic of young children. The physical effects of his ordeal, the minor scrapes, the temporary weight loss, the lingering fatigue, had resolved within days. The psychological impact had proven more complex but less traumatic than experts initially feared. He talks about it like an adventure, Sarah explained to Dr. Lisa Hoffman, the child psychologist who had been monitoring Ethan's emotional recovery. There's no fear when he describes the forest, just matter-of-fact explanations about how Max helped Ethan. Dr. Hoffman nodded, watching through her office window as Ethan played with building blocks on the floor. Max vigilantly positioned beside him. That's actually healthy. Children this age process trauma differently than adults. The presence of Max throughout the experience provided a consistent source of security and comfort, mitigating what could have been a deeply frightening situation. The puppy had experienced his own changes. Now 4 months old, Max had grown noticeably, though veterinarians predicted he would remain somewhat smaller than average for his breed, perhaps a consequence of his difficult start in life. More striking than his physical development was his behavior. The bond with Ethan had evolved into something remarkable, with Max displaying awareness and protective instincts far beyond typical canine development. He always knows where Ethan is, Michael told visitors with a mixture of amazement and pride. Even if they're in different rooms, Max checks on him regularly, and he still sleeps pressed against him every night. The media attention had gradually subsided, though national magazines occasionally requested interviews or follow-up stories. Sarah and Michael had become selective about such requests, prioritizing Ethan's return to normal life while acknowledging public interest in their extraordinary story. One commitment they had embraced wholeheartedly was working with the county's wilderness safety program. What had begun as a personal tragedy narrowly averted had evolved into an opportunity to prevent similar situations for other families. Michael had helped develop a child-friendly education program about outdoor safety, while Sarah spoke to parent groups about emergency preparedness. On this particular morning, they prepared for a special event, the County Animal Shelter's annual fundraiser, where Max would receive an award created specifically to honor his actions. The Hero Companion recognition had generated substantial donations for the shelter, where Max had once been an overlooked runt facing uncertain prospects. "Is Max getting a medal?" Ethan asked as Sarah helped him into his special outfit for the ceremony, tiny dress pants and a shirt that matched the blue bandana Max would wear. "Something like that," Sarah smiled, "because he was so brave and took such good care of you." Ethan nodded solemnly. "Max is the bravest dog. He scared away the bad animals and found water and kept Ethan warm." This third-person narration had become Ethan's preferred way of describing their ordeal, a linguistic distancing that Dr. Hoffman suggested was his way of processing the experience. The ceremony took place in the community park, not far from the edge of the forest that had nearly claimed Ethan's life. The symbolism wasn't lost on Sarah as she looked between the manicured green space and the wild tree line beyond. Nature could be both playground and peril, a duality that parenthood required constant navigation. A crowd had gathered: search, volunteers, medical personnel, animal rescue workers, and community members touched by the story. Sheriff Monroe and Wildlife Officer Jensen sat in the front row alongside Dr. Wilson, whose research on canine behavior had gained new dimensions through studying Max. When Ethan and Max were called forward to receive the award, the crowd fell, silent, watching as the small boy and his devoted puppy approached the podium together. The shelter director knelt to place a special medallion on Max's bandana, then presented Ethan with a framed certificate commemorating their story. "Heroes come in all sizes," the director said, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering. Max reminds us that courage, loyalty, and love are not limited by age, size, or even species. Ethan, somewhat overwhelmed by the attention but bolstered by Max's steady presence, smiled shyly. When invited to say something, he simply patted Max's head and declared, "Max is Ethan's best friend forever." The simplicity and depth of this statement brought tears to many eyes. No elaborate speech could have better captured the essence of their bond. After the ceremony, as attendees mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Jim Parker approached the Carter family with someone they hadn't met before, a tall man in a ranger's uniform. "This is Steve Wilson from the state's Search Dog Training Program," Parker introduced. He's been following Max's story with particular interest. The ranger shook hands with Sarah and Michael before kneeling to observe Max, who remained faithfully at Ethan's side despite the bustle of activity around them. "What this puppy did was extraordinary," Wilson said. "We trained search and rescue dogs for months to develop the skills Max demonstrated instinctively. His ability to find water, seek shelter, protect from wildlife. These are advanced behaviors we struggle to teach adult dogs." "Do you think it was instinct?" Michael asked, watching as Ethan shared a cookie with Max, carefully breaking it. "Into people piece and dog piece portions, partly," Wilson acknowledged. "But there's something more here, an emotional intelligence, a capacity for problem solving in crisis. We'd like to document Max's abilities, perhaps even use him as a model for our training programs, if you'd be open to occasional visits." The idea that Max's remarkable actions might help train dogs to find other lost children appealed deeply to Sarah and Michael. What had begun as their personal nightmare could transform into a legacy of lives saved. As the event wound down, the family walked home together through their neighborhood. Ethan skipped ahead on the sidewalk, Max trotting beside him, both bathed in late afternoon sunlight that turned their shadows into elongated companions dancing before them. Sarah and Michael followed at a slight distance, hands linked, watching. The boy and dog who had returned from the wilderness fundamentally changed, yet somehow more completely themselves. "Do you think he'll remember any of this when he's older?" Michael wondered aloud. Sarah considered the question. Not the details, maybe, but the feeling of it, knowing there was someone who stayed with him through the darkest moments, who never gave up on him. "I think that stays forever." Ahead of them, Ethan had stopped to examine something in the grass, a bright wildflower growing through a crack in the sidewalk. Max waited patiently, his attention divided between the fascinating discovery and his ongoing awareness of his small human's safety. Such ordinary moments now carried extraordinary weight, the simple gift of continued life, of growth, of tomorrows that had nearly been lost. The Carter family had been tested by forces beyond their control and forever changed by the experience, and through it all, the unlikeliest hero, a once unwanted puppy whose devotion had transcended instinct, training, and even reasonable expectation, continued his quiet guardianship, asking nothing in return but the companionship of the small boy he had guided home from the wilderness. Some called it a miracle. Others searched for scientific explanations in canine behavior and evolutionary bonds. But for Ethan, the truth was much simpler, captured in the words he whispered each night as he fell asleep with Max curled protectively beside him. Max and Ethan, best friends forever.